Hey guys, it's Chris from Highline Guitars, and here's this week's quick tip for luthiers. As I've said in the past, one of my favorite finishes is a hand-rubbed oil-based finish. And I like to start out by using Danish oil, which soaks into the wood very well. And then after it's been allowed to dry a couple of days, I'll apply a couple of coats of a wipe-on polyurethane for added protection. But what I also like to do to get the smoothest, nicest surface is to wet sand the surface using a succession of waterproof sandpapers. And I'll typically start out using a 400 grit wet dry sandpaper. And I'll sand the surface using mineral spirits as a lubricant. Then I'll jump to 800, and then I'll finish with 1500 grit. And once I'm done, I have a really smooth surface. So let me bring you in real close and I'll show you typically what a session of wet sanding with waterproof sandpaper is like with this kind of oil-based finish. Level sanding the surface is really easy, and what you're going to need is a sheet of each different grade of sandpaper that will be used. And as I mentioned before, it's going to be 400, 800, and 1500 grit sandpaper. And you're going to want to use waterproof wet dry sandpaper. You're also going to need a sanding block. And what I like to do is go to my dollar store during the spring and pick up these. They're flip-flops, and I'll cut up the soles of the flip-flops to make different size sanding blocks, and they work really well. Plus they're cheap, so once you're done using one and it's gotten pretty dirty, you can just toss it and cut a new one. No big deal. And I've already done the surface of this guitar with the 400 grit, so I'm going to show you as I sand with 800 grit. The process is pretty much the same. And what I'm actually doing is I'm replacing the previous grit with the grit that I'm currently using. So since I've already sanded the surface with 400 grit, I've left 400 grit sanding scratches in the surface. And of course at 400 grit it's really hard to see those. They're almost invisible. But what I'll be doing is replacing those 400 grit scratches with 800 grit. Now I always recommend using a P-grade sandpaper because the grains used on P-grade sandpapers are more precise and produce a much more consistent scratch pattern. So you always want to use, if you're going to start out with like a 400 grit, you're going to want to use a P400, then a P800, and then a P1500 grit. And that way you're staying consistent in your sanding and you'll get better results. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this plastic container, and all this is whenever I buy something from the store that has a blister pack like this, I'll save the plastic and use that as my container for the lubricant that I'll be using, which in this case is an odorless mineral spirits. I like to use odorless because obviously it's odorless. And I'll just pour a small amount into the container. Doesn't take a lot. Then I'll take my 800 grit and I'll just get it good and saturated with the mineral spirits, and then wrap it around my sanding block. And then I'll just start working, sanding in the direction of the grain, just in small areas at a time. And you don't have to spend a lot of time sanding because by this point most of your wood has been sanded pretty smooth. And what you're really trying to do here is just bring it up to that highest level of smooth finish. And as you're sanding, the 800 grit is reacting with the Danish oil and the wipe-on polyurethane that I put down earlier, and it's creating a very faint, kind of a sludgy-like mix, which will pack down into any remaining grain that is present, and it will dry there. And you're also going to want to keep some paper towels handy because you'll want to wipe the surface down as you're working just to keep it clean. And you can actually feel how incredibly smooth the surface is going to get. I like to use Viva paper towels because they don't relieve a lot of lint on the surface. And then I'll just continue to work, sanding the entire surface as smooth as possible. I also recommend that you have some good lighting where you're working, because as you're sanding, that light will reflect off the surface and it will help you to see any potential flaws in the surface, like scratches, dings, nicks, and that sort of thing. And hopefully, if there are any issues, you can sand those out. Typically, you would do that with the 400 grit, because like I said, with the 800 grit, what I'm trying to do is just reduce the sanding scratches that were left by the 400 grit and replace them with 800 grit sanding scratches. Now, once I have finished sanding with the 800 grit, I'll set that piece of sandpaper aside so the mineral spirits it's soaked with can evaporate. And then I'll take my P1500 grit and I'll just do essentially the same thing I did with the 800, just lightly sanding the surface to remove the 800 grit sanding scratches and replace them with 1500 grit sanding scratches. 1500 grit sanding scratches are so faint that you really would need a magnifying glass or a microscope to see them. But when you run your hands over the surface after it's dry, it's incredibly smooth. So I'll just keep working this way over the surface of the guitar, getting it nice and smooth. As you can see, it doesn't take terribly long to do this. And then periodically I'll wipe it down with my paper towel and use my overhead light to help me to see the quality of the surface as I've sanded it. And then once I'm done with the 1500 grit, I'll let the surface completely dry. Now, once the mineral spirits have evaporated and the surface of the wood is dry, you may notice in some spots where it appears as though you've sanded through and removed some of the color. And so the surface has kind of that inconsistent look. So what I need to do is simply apply a final application of my wipe-on poly and wipe it on very thin and smooth to bring the color back to a consistent appearance. And I will do that using my poly, and I'm just going to put a small amount onto a paper towel and then just rub that into the surface, just going as thin as possible so as not to build up too much on the surface. And I like to really wipe it down, removing all the residual. And that's how we bring the color back. All right, so I'll hang up the guitar body probably for a couple of days and let that last application of wipe-on poly fully dry and cure. And in the meantime, I need to dispose of all my rags, my gloves, my container, all the sandpaper I used properly, because mineral spirits and oil-based products are flammable. So what I'll do is I'll just lay these out on the concrete floor of my shop away from any open flame, and I'll let them completely dry for several days, making sure that nothing is piled up and touching each other. So it's all going to be spread out. Then I'll put it all into an airtight container, fill that with water, and then I can dispose of it properly. So until the next episode, take care, and we will see you soon.